The morning that changed everything. The sun painted golden streaks across Buckingham Palace's imposing gates as thousands of tourists gathered for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood 8-year-old Emma Watson with her parents, who had traveled from Manchester for their first visit to London. Emma clutched her small Union Jack flag, her eyes wide with wonder at the magnificent red-coated guards standing motionless at their posts. Sergeant James Morrison had been a Queen's Guard for 12 years. At 34, he was considered one of the most disciplined soldiers in the regiment. His 6-foot frame stood perfectly still beneath the iconic bearskin hat, his rifle held with military precision. Morrison had weathered countless ceremonies, enduring scorching summer heat, bitter winter cold, and relentless tourist cameras. Nothing was supposed to break his stoic composure. The morning crowd was particularly dense, with visitors from around the world pressing against the barriers. Tour guides spoke in multiple languages. Children pointed excitedly at the guards, and cameras clicked incessantly. Morrison's trained eyes scanned the crowd periodically, a habit ingrained through years of security awareness, though his expression remained unchanged. Emma had been feeling unwell since breakfast. Her mother, Sarah Watson, noticed her daughter's pale complexion, but attributed it to excitement and early morning travel. They had caught the 6 a.m. train from Manchester, and Emma had barely touched her breakfast. As the ceremony preparation began, Emma pressed closer to the barrier, determined not to miss a moment of the spectacle she had dreamed about for months. The other guards took their positions with mechanical precision. The familiar sounds of military commands echoed across the courtyard as tourists hushed in anticipation. Morrison could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, but his focus remained absolute. He had performed this ceremony over 2,000 times, each movement rehearsed to perfection. Emma's vision began to blur as she watched the guards. The excitement, combined with her empty stomach and the pressing crowd around her, created a perfect storm of circumstances. Her small hand loosened its grip on the flag as dizziness overwhelmed her senses. Sarah Watson was momentarily distracted, taking photos of the ceremony preparation, unaware of her daughter's deteriorating condition. As the first military commands rang out across the square, Emma Watson took one final look at the magnificent guards before her world went dark. Her small body crumpled to the ground with a soft thud that was barely audible above the crowd's murmur. The tourists around her initially didn't notice the fallen child among the sea of legs and feet. Morrison's peripheral vision caught the movement. Years of military training had honed his awareness to detect even the slightest anomalies. While maintaining his rigid posture, his eyes tracked toward the disturbance in the crowd. What he saw would challenge every protocol he had ever learned and force him to make a split-second decision that would define his character. The ceremony was about to begin, but for Morrison, everything had suddenly changed. The weight of duty pressed against his shoulders as heavily as his ceremonial uniform, while somewhere in the crowd a child lay unconscious, unknown to most of the gathered spectators who continued their excited chatter, oblivious to the drama unfolding at their feet. The impossible choice, Sarah Watson turned from her camera just in time to see her daughter collapse. Her scream pierced through the morning air, causing nearby tourists to step back in alarm. Emma lay motionless on the cobblestones, her small body looking even tinier against the ancient stones of the palace courtyard. Panic spread through the immediate area as people realized a child had fallen unconscious. Morrison's training kicked into overdrive. His eyes locked onto the scene while his body remained frozen in position. Every fiber of his military discipline screamed at him to maintain his post. Queen's Guards were legendary for their unwavering composure. There were famous stories of guards standing motionless while bees swarmed their faces during thunderstorms, and even when tourists tried to provoke reactions. Breaking position during a ceremony was unthinkable, but Morrison was also a father. His own 7-year-old daughter Lucy flashed through his mind. He could see Emma's pale face, the way her small chest barely rose and fell, the terror in her mother's voice. The crowd around the child seemed frozen in that peculiar way. People freeze during emergencies, unsure of what to do, looking around for someone else to take charge. The ceremony commander's voice boomed across the courtyard, beginning the traditional sequence. Morrison's fellow guards remained at perfect attention, though he could sense their awareness of the commotion in the crowd. Protocol demanded they continue regardless of outside distractions. The Queen's Guard did not break formation. Ever. Emma's lips had taken on a bluish tint and her breathing appeared shallow and irregular. Sarah Watson knelt beside her daughter, her hands shaking as she tried to rouse the unconscious child. Other tourists fumbled with their phones trying to call for help, but the process seemed agonizingly slow. Emergency services would take precious minutes to arrive, and every second counted. Morrison calculated the distance. Approximately 200 yards of open ground separated his post from the collapsed child. 200 yards that might as well have been 2 miles given the protocols binding him to his position. His commanding officer stood nearby, clipboard in hand, orchestrating the ceremony with military precision. Breaking ranks would mean immediate disciplinary action, possible dismissal from the guards, and the end of a distinguished military career. The internal battle raged in Morrison's mind with lightning speed. 12 years of service, countless hours of training, the honor of his regiment, his reputation among his peers, all balanced against the life of a single child he had never met. His military identity had been forged through absolute obedience to orders and unwavering discipline in the face of any distraction. Yet Emma's condition was clearly deteriorating. Morrison had completed advanced first aid training as part of his military service. He could see signs that alarmed him: the child's unnatural stillness, the way her head had struck the cobblestones, the increasing panic in her mother's voice as she pleaded for someone to help. The crowd of tourists, despite their good intentions, seemed helpless in the face of the medical emergency. His grip tightened imperceptibly on his rifle. Sweat beaded beneath his bearskin hat despite the cool morning air. Morrison faced the most difficult decision of his military career, knowing that whatever choice he made in the next few seconds would echo through the rest of his life. The ceremony continued around him, but time seemed suspended as he weighed duty against conscience, protocol against humanity. The sprint that shocked the world in one fluid motion that stunned thousands of onlookers. Sergeant James Morrison abandoned his post. His rifle clattered to the cobblestones as he broke into a full sprint toward the crowd, his heavy military boots pounding against the ancient stones with thunderous echoes. The sound reverberated off the palace walls like gunshots, causing heads to turn in disbelief throughout the courtyard. The crowd parted like waves as Morrison charged through them, his red coat flying behind him, his bearskin hat somehow remaining perfectly positioned despite his speed. Tourists scrambled out of his way, some raising their cameras instinctively to capture this unprecedented moment. Never in recorded history had a Queen's Guard broken formation during a ceremony for any reason. The sight was so shocking that many spectators stood frozen, unable to process what they were witnessing. Morrison's commanding officer, Major Harrison, watched in complete disbelief as one of his most reliable sergeants committed what amounted to military mutiny in front of thousands of witnesses. The major's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. The ceremony ground to a confused halt as other guards maintained their positions, but clearly struggled to understand what was happening. Radio chatter erupted among security personnel as they tried to determine if this was a security threat or some kind of breakdown. Emma's condition had worsened dramatically. Her breathing had become so shallow it was barely detectable, and her skin had taken on an alarming gray pallor. Sarah Watson held her daughter's limp hand, tears streaming down her face as she begged her child to wake up. The crowd around them had grown larger but remained helplessly watching, creating a human circle of anxiety around the unconscious girl. Morrison covered the 200 yards in what felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat. His military fitness served him well as he navigated through the dense crowd without slowing his pace. Years of training had conditioned his body for exactly this kind of physical demand, though nothing had prepared him for the emotional weight of abandoning everything he had sworn to uphold. As he dropped to his knees beside Emma, Morrison's military training seamlessly shifted from ceremonial precision to life-saving action. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked her pulse, which was rapid and weak, and assessed her breathing, which was critically shallow. The fall had been more serious than initially apparent. Emma had struck her head on the unforgiving cobblestones, and Morrison suspected a possible concussion or worse. The crowd pressed closer, their collective anxiety palpable in the morning air. Cameras clicked and whirred as the unprecedented scene unfolded, but Morrison blocked out everything except the small, still form beneath his hands. He gently repositioned Emma's head to ensure her airway remained clear. his movements precise and confident despite the chaos surrounding them. Sarah Watson looked up at the imposing figure of the Queen's Guard kneeling beside her daughter. Through her tears, she managed to whisper Emma's name and age, providing Morrison with crucial information. His voice, when he spoke, carried the same authority that had commanded troops, but now it was directed toward saving a life rather than following orders. Morrison began rescue breathing, his training taking over completely. Each breath he gave the unconscious child was measured and controlled, his focus absolute despite the growing crowd of onlookers and the certain knowledge that his military career was likely over. The sound of approaching sirens began to wail in the distance, but Morrison knew that every second counted in Emma's fight for consciousness. The other guards remained at their posts, though their rigid discipline was clearly being tested by the extraordinary circumstances. The ceremony had effectively ended, though no official order to dismiss had been given. Major Harrison spoke urgently into his radio, trying to manage the crisis that was unfolding before the eyes of the world. Life returns. Emma's eyelids fluttered as Morrison's steady rescue breathing began to take effect. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as the small girl drew her first strong breath in several terrifying minutes. Color slowly returned to her pale cheeks, though she remained disoriented and weak. Morrison continued his assessment, checking her pupils for signs of serious head trauma while speaking to her in gentle, reassuring tones. The paramedics arrived with a clatter of equipment and urgent professionalism. Morrison smoothly transitioned from primary responder to supporting the medical team, providing them with clear, concise information about Emma's condition and his observations. His military training in medical emergencies proved invaluable as he communicated exactly what he had found and what actions he had taken. Sarah Watson grasped Morrison's hand with both of hers, her gratitude spilling out in broken sentences between her relieved sobs. Emma was conscious now, though clearly confused and frightened by the crowd of faces staring down at her. Morrison stayed close, his presence somehow comforting to both mother and child, even though his own future had become increasingly uncertain with each passing minute. The crowd began to disperse slightly as the paramedics established control of the scene, but hundreds of onlookers remained, many still recording the extraordinary events on their phones. Social media was already exploding with videos and photos of the Queen's Guard who had abandoned his post to save a child. The hashtag #HeroGuard was trending within minutes as people around the world shared the unprecedented footage. Major Harrison approached the scene with rigid military bearing, his face a mask of controlled anger and professional embarrassment. The breach of protocol was severe enough to end Morrison's career, and both men knew it. However, the major also recognized that they were in the middle of a public relations situation that required delicate handling. The entire incident had been witnessed by thousands and recorded by dozens of cameras. Emma was loaded onto a stretcher, her condition stabilized but requiring hospital evaluation for possible head trauma. As she was lifted, she looked directly at Morrison with the clear eyes of a child who understood that this large man in the strange hat had helped her. Her small voice was barely audible as she whispered, a simple thank you that cut through. Morrison's military composure more effectively than any reprimand could have the ceremonial area slowly returned to some semblance of order. Though the normal rhythm of the day had been completely disrupted, Morrison stood alone near where Emma had fallen, his rifle retrieved and held loosely at his side. No longer the perfectly composed guardsman, but a soldier who had chosen humanity over protocol. The weight of his decision was beginning to settle on his shoulders. Other members of the Queen's Guard exchanged glances that spoke volumes. While they couldn't voice support publicly, there was an understanding among them that Morrison had faced an impossible choice. Many were fathers themselves, and the sight of the unconscious child had affected them all, even though only Morrison had acted on that instinct. News crews were already arriving, alerted by the viral social media posts. The story was spreading rapidly across news networks and internet platforms, with initial reports focusing on the dramatic rescue and the unprecedented breach of Queen's Guard protocol. Public reaction was swift and overwhelmingly supportive of Morrison's actions, though military leadership would be held to different standards. As Morrison was quietly escorted away from the ceremony area, he caught one last glimpse of the ambulance carrying Emma to the hospital. The small Union Jack flag she had dropped still lay on the cobblestones, a silent reminder of the excitement and wonder that had brought her family to London that morning. and the life-threatening emergency that had changed everything for everyone involved. The price of heroism. The disciplinary hearing took place 3 days later in an austere military conference room at Wellington Barracks. Morrison sat at attention before a panel of senior officers, his dress uniform immaculate despite the gravity of his situation. The charges were serious. Abandoning post during ceremonial duties, breach of protocol, and conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline. Each charge carried the potential for dismissal from service. Major Harrison presented the military's case with professional detachment, though his obvious discomfort with the proceedings was evident to everyone present. The facts were undeniable. Morrison had violated fundamental protocols that formed the backbone of Queen's Guard service. The ceremonial duties were not merely traditional pageantry, but represented the disciplined professionalism of the British military. Breaking formation, regardless of reason, challenged the very foundations of military order. Morrison's defense was simple and direct. He accepted full responsibility for his actions and expressed no regret for choosing to save Emma's life. When asked by the panel if he understood the seriousness of his breach, Morrison replied that he understood both the military consequences and the fact that a child was alive because of his decision. His calm acceptance of responsibility impressed even his critics. Meanwhile, Emma Watson was recovering well in the hospital. The head trauma had been less severe than initially feared, though doctors confirmed that Morrison's immediate first aid had likely prevented more serious complications. The delay in proper breathing support could have resulted in brain damage or worse. Medical professionals who reviewed the incident praised Morrison's quick assessment and appropriate response. Public support for Morrison exploded across all media platforms. Thousands of messages poured into military headquarters demanding that no action be taken against the heroic Guard. Petitions circulated online gathering hundreds of thousands of signatures. News interviews with Emma's parents painted Morrison as a hero who had sacrificed his career to save their daughter's life. International media picked up the story, portraying it as an example of humanity triumphing over rigid bureaucracy. The military found itself in an impossible position. Protocol demanded punishment for Morrison's actions, yet public sentiment strongly supported his choice. Senior military leadership struggled to balance their need to maintain discipline with the recognition that Morrison's actions had been morally correct. The case highlighted the sometimes competing demands of military duty and human compassion. Morrison's fellow guards privately expressed solidarity with his decision, though few could speak publicly due to military regulations. Many admitted they hoped they would have shown the same courage if faced with similar circumstances. The bond among the Queen's Guard strengthened as they witnessed one of their own face consequences for choosing to save a life. Emma's recovery progressed steadily, and she repeatedly asked her parents when she could thank the nice soldier who had helped her. Her innocent questions about why helping someone could get a person in trouble highlighted the moral complexity of Morrison's situation in ways that military regulations couldn't address. The contrast between a child's simple understanding of right and wrong and the rigid structure of military discipline became a central theme in public discussions. The hearing panel deliberated for hours, weighing precedent against circumstance, regulation against morality. Their decision would set a standard for how the military balanced human compassion with professional duty. Morrison waited with characteristic stoicism, knowing that whatever judgment was rendered, he could live with the consequences of choosing to save Emma Watson's life. As news of the hearing spread, crowds gathered outside the military facility, many holding signs supporting Morrison. The overwhelming public message was clear. The guard who broke ranks to save a child deserved recognition, not punishment. The pressure on military leadership intensified as the story continued to capture international attention and sympathy. Honor beyond protocol. The hearing panel returned with a decision that surprised everyone involved. Colonel Williams, the senior officer, announced that while Morrison's breach of protocol was severe and could not be ignored, the circumstances were extraordinary and unprecedented. The military recognized that Morrison had faced an impossible choice between duty to protocol and duty to preserve life. His actions, though technically wrong, were morally justified and demonstrated the highest values of military service. Morrison received an official reprimand on his service record for breach of protocol, but he would remain in service with the Queen's Guard. More significantly, The panel recommended him for a commendation recognizing his life-saving actions and moral courage under extreme circumstances. The military had found a way to maintain discipline while acknowledging that sometimes humanity must override protocol. The announcement was met with thunderous applause from the crowds gathered outside, and news of the decision spread rapidly across social media and news networks. Military leadership had managed to thread the needle between maintaining order and recognizing heroism. Morrison's case would become a landmark example of how military justice could adapt to extraordinary circumstances. Emma Watson made a full recovery and returned to Manchester with her family, but not before a special meeting was arranged between her and Morrison. The reunion took place in a quiet hospital room, away from media attention, where Emma could properly thank her rescuer. Morrison, now in civilian clothes, seemed more emotional meeting the healthy child than he had during his own disciplinary hearing. Emma presented Morrison with a drawing she had made during her recovery. It showed a tall figure in a red coat and black hat holding the hand of a small girl, with "My Hero" written in a child's careful handwriting across the top. Morrison later said this simple gift meant more to him than any military decoration he had ever received. The bond between the guard and the child he had saved became a symbol of the human connections that transcend duty and protocol. The Queen herself was briefed on the incident and its resolution. Through official channels, it was quietly communicated that Her Majesty found Morrison's actions commendable and representative of the finest traditions of service to others. While the Queen could not publicly comment on military discipline matters, her private support carried significant weight within military circles. Morrison returned to his duties with the Queen's Guard, though his experience had changed him profoundly. He continued to serve with distinction, but colleagues noted a different quality to his service, a deeper understanding of the balance between duty and humanity. The incident had taught the entire regiment that true military honor sometimes required the courage to break from protocol when human life was at stake. The story of Morrison's choice continued to resonate around the world as an example of moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. Military academies began using the case as a teaching tool for discussions about ethics, leadership, and the sometimes competing demands of duty and conscience. Morrison himself rarely spoke publicly about the incident, preferring to let his actions stand for themselves. Years later, Morrison and Emma maintained a correspondence that brought joy to both their families. Emma grew up knowing that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is choose compassion over convenience, courage over conformity. Morrison's daughter, Lucy, learned that her father was a hero not because he wore a uniform, but because he was willing to sacrifice everything to save a stranger's child. The morning that had begun as a routine ceremony at Buckingham Palace had ended with profound lessons about the nature of duty, the importance of human life, and the courage required to do what is right even when it conflicts with what is expected. Morrison's 200-yard sprint had covered more than just physical distance. It had bridged the gap between rigid protocol and human compassion, proving that sometimes the greatest act of service is the willingness to serve humanity above all other masters.